Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Smyrna, September 1922, The American Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide, by Lou Ureneck, narrated by David Vries. Note on the text. This is a true story. In creating a narrative account of the events at Smyrna, I have drawn on the reports, letters, and diaries of U.S. naval officers, declassified American intelligence reports, and American and British diplomatic cables. I have also employed the first-person accounts of American missionaries and relief workers and British sailors and officers who witnessed the fire and its aftermath. It has been my good fortune to receive access to the personal papers and letters of key figures in the story. Asa Jennings, Halsey Powell, Alexander McLaughlin, Caleb Lawrence, and George and Nancy Horton. Some of this material had not been previously available. The principal contribution of this book is the astonishing story of the American rescue at Smyrna based on the testimony of those who participated in it. For the broader context against which the forward story unfolds, including background on the Paris peace talks and their immediate aftermath, the discovery of oil in the Near East, the life of Mustapha Kemal, and the religious slaughter that swept Turkey in the early 20th century, I have drawn on the work of numerous eminent scholars and experts, including Michael Llewellyn-Smith, Richard Hovhannissian, Daniel Yergin, and the late Andrew Mango, who generously responded to my questions in the final year of his life. Some landscape and seascape descriptions in the book are mine, based on numerous visits to key locations in the story. I have relied on contemporaneous newspaper accounts of the catastrophe at Smyrna when those accounts lined up with observations of others who were present. For the towns and cities of the Ottoman Empire, I have used the names that would have been used by Americans in the story, Smyrna and Constantinople, for example, rather than the Turkish names Izmir and Istanbul. For the names of Turkish figures, I have chosen to go with what seemed easiest for English speakers to pronounce. I use the term Near East because it was the term used at the time of these events. The Near East included the Balkan countries and Greece, Asia Minor, meaning the Turkish peninsula between the Black and Mediterranean Seas and otherwise known as Anatolia, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, the so-called Levant, the eastern rim of the Mediterranean down to Egypt. The Near East also embraced Persia and the Arabian Peninsula. The contemporary term Middle East came into general use after the events of this story. I use Turkey and the Ottoman Empire interchangeably, as was common in the period. The Republic of Turkey came into existence in 1923. At the time of these events, most Muslims in Turkey had one name. Occasionally, a second name was added. Names were typically accented on the final syllable, Mustapha Kemal. Among the Turks, Bey was an honorific meaning Sir, Pasha was a general or high-ranking statesman. Effendi was a title of respect for a man of high status or education. Hanum meant lady or madam. In 1922, the ethnic Greeks of the Ottoman Empire used the Julian calendar. The Turks used the Islamic calendar, and the Europeans and Americans used the Gregorian calendar, which is the calendar used here. Forward. Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter noon, Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, unshaven, with a pocket full of currents, CIF London, documents at sight, asked me in demotic French to luncheon at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. These lines follow an evocation of the rape of Philomela, and the speaker is the blind hermaphroditic seer Tiresias of Thebes, old and barren, once a figure of Sophoclean tragedy, now a degraded male prostitute invited to a sordid assignation with another Greek. But the contempt in which Eliot holds these two Hellenes. His client is a scruffy Levantine merchant. CIF, for his pitiful pocketful of raisins, means carriage and insurance free. The man can summon only pidgin French, and his Greek surname, Eugenides, literally of noble birth, is viciously sardonic. The poet T.S. Eliot, a Harvard grad with Boston Brahmin roots newly transplanted to Britain, generally reserved his unfathomably venomous hatred for my own tribe, whose name, even after the Holocaust, he refused to capitalize in new printings. The Jew squats on the windowsill, the owner, spawned in some estaminet of Antwerp, blistered in Brussels, patched and peeled in London. The rats are underneath the piles. The Jew is underneath the lot. But in the surreal post-war landscape of the wasteland, a Greek of Asia Minor is made to bear the multiple stigmata of degeneracy, homosexuality, bodily ugliness, base material greed, and the linguistic inarticulacy of an uprooted alien. One understands a work in the context of its time, and an anachronistic judgment of its prejudices, one based on the standards of a more liberal age, is to a degree unfair. The Roaring Twenties, Flappers, the Charleston, the Speakeasy, John Dos Passos's Manhattan Transfer, but also Harvard's notorious secret courts that persecuted and destroyed gay students, Harvard President Lowell's infamous numerus clausus that shut the gates of learning to Jews, lynchings of young black men, eugenics, nativist hysteria about Untermenschen, subhuman immigrants mobbing the gates. It is an almost unfamiliar world. Almost. But look at the date. The date, 1922. In the late summer of that year, the armies of Mustapha Kemal, the later Ataturk, father of the Turks, broke the Greek lines in western Anatolia and smashed through to the Ionian coast on the Aegean. Smyrna, the Izmir of today, was a vast, rich, modern, cosmopolitan city with up-to-date movie theaters, newspapers, schools, motor cars, cafes. It has ancient roots. It faces the Greek island of Chios, Homer's home across the harbor. The climate is pleasant, people are cultivated, courteous. Outside town are the lush orchards where half-European, half-Greek, or Armenian businessmen and women called the Levantines, people like Mr. Eugenides, grow figs for the table of the King of England. They speak perfect Turkish, Greek, Armenian, English, Italian, and, yes, French. But now the Greek army is retreating in long, weary columns, followed by fleeing farming families with terror in their eyes. The population swells. The Kemalists conquer the town and drive the Christian population onto the Quay and begin to sever limbs with their cavalry sabers and to push screaming human beings into the water. They flail helplessly and drown. Muslim mobs torture the Greek archbishop to death, gouging out his eyes. Then the Turkish army, working according to plan, empties jerry cans of kerosene into buildings and round about the Greek and Armenian quarters of the town. On September 13, an easy day to remember, think of 2 days before, 3 generations on, the entire city goes up in flames. Nothing like it has ever been seen before, not even in the Great War, just ended. And what is the response of the West? Newspapers duly report the horror, but the great powers refuse to act. An Allied destroyer in the harbor turns up gramophones on deck to drown out the screams, and sailors are forced to turn away swimmers trying to clamber on board. Some of the latter are sucked into the ship's propellers. The harbor is choked with floating corpses. The American plenipotentiary in Constantinople, a naval officer named Mark Bristol, may God blot out his name and memory, derides Greeks and Armenians as mongrel races quite as inferior as the Jews, and attempts to frustrate all attempts at rescue. As I write these lines in 2015, refugees from Syria are drowning in those same waters. His Holiness Pope Francis is right to speak of the globalization of indifference, but perhaps the Holy Father errs slightly in implying that the phenomenon is new. And, considering the poison lines of Mr. Eliot, one might add that at the edge of the vast black tarry ocean of indifference to the sufferings of the innocent flicker the hellish little flames of derision and contempt. America is interested not in Greek and Armenian lives, has it ever been, but in its new post-war geopolitical position as the world's creditor. It needs a foothold in the Near East, and France and Britain have already appropriated Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Lebanon, and the land of Israel to themselves. The U.S. does not wish to offend Turkey. As always, the conscience of the world rests on the frail shoulders of an individual. A newly arrived official of the YMCA, Asa Jennings, manages the impossible. Pretending authority, he marshals a fleet of merchant vessels and passenger steamers, the fleet of Agamemnon and Menelaus on a mission of mercy, or Dunkirk of Entre les Lettres. Hundreds of thousands are lost, but nearly as many are saved, and to this day you may see their descendants in the neighborhood of Smyrna, New Smyrna, which began as a refugee shantytown in central Athens. Marjorie Housepian Dopkin, professor of English and dean of students at Barnard College, was the daughter of one of the refugees from Smyrna. She assaulted the archives and wrote the first book, The Smyrna Affair in other editions, about a great crime whose very memory the United States, in its indecent eagerness to placate its Turkish ally, attempted for decades to suppress. I read it as a young man in one sitting, through the night, looking up, baffled and chilled at the dawn light seeping through the windows of the library at Wadham College, Oxford. Some years later came Milton's ironically named Paradise Lost, whose particular virtue is its vivid evocation of the lives of the Levantines. But now we have the all-embracing work on the Smyrna disaster of a professional historian. Lou Ureneck's authoritative book is a masterpiece of scholarly precision unlikely ever to be superseded. It draws on new scholarship, additional sources, and more archival material. One comes to know better Asa Kent Jennings, the YMCA hero, and learns more about the despicable Bristol. Ureneck has discovered the extraordinary contribution of Lieutenant Commander Halsey Powell, who risked his career to support the evacuation. The book details the communication between Jennings, Powell, and a third important character, the Greek battleship commander Ioannis Theophanidis, who supported Jennings as the latter called the bluff of the Greek government in Athens so he could assemble his rescue fleet. The book shows that the rescue was arranged without the knowledge of Bristol. When its full dimensions were revealed to him, he sought in vain to block it. Most of this material comes from a close reading of State Department cables and reports, while other key elements emerge from the personal papers of Jennings and others. The dark tides of the Smyrna disaster spin and eddy very close to home. One of the Smyrna refugees was an Armenian priest, literally plucked from the water. Father Gevon Turian, a relative of Bedros Turian, whose lyrics are in many ways the foundation of modern Western Armenian poetry. After the Smyrna disaster, Father Gevon studied in Britain and went on to become the Archbishop of the Armenian Church in America. He was brutally assassinated on Christmas Day, 1933, in a political struggle between Armenian factions as he celebrated Mass at the Holy Cross Church of Armenia in Washington Heights, New York City. As he lay dying, the parishioners rang the nearest doctor, who lived a block away on Wadsworth Avenue, and little Marjorie Housepian, the physician's daughter, was the one who picked up the phone. The horror of the killing of a man himself saved from an unimaginable massacre made the front page of the New York Times for weeks and strangely sparked the mainstream American imagination. 10 years after the killing, the father of the beat poets, William S. Burroughs, was to name a character Turian in his first novel, and the hippos were boiled in their tanks, the story of another murder. Washington Heights is where I grew up, a leafy middle-class neighborhood where Jews, Armenians, Greeks, Irishmen, Dominicans, Italians, and many others live together in harmony and eat each other's pizza, bagels, and rice and beans. An Armenian-American friend, Gladys Pratt, lived next door to me and made delicious stuffed grape leaves. One of her relatives had been a lawyer who defended one of Archbishop Turian's killers. She recalled the convict, released after decades from prison, crying as he cradled a little child of his family. And on the wall of her dining room was a little painting of a pleasant side street with overhanging balconies and shade trees in another country. I learned that it was her ancestors' hometown, Smyrna. The political passions of the old country had reached these shores. But it is not all bad. Some years later, as a professor at Harvard, I had the honor to teach Armenian to a Turkish student named Murat, who loves Woody Allen's Manhattan and whose hometown is Izmir. There is a new generation of Turkish scholars, humanists, and activists who refuse the enforced oblivion of the system. They, and people like them everywhere, are our brothers and sisters, and our hope. We must think carefully, says my Turkish colleague and dear friend Himmet Tashkumur, about the kind of world we want to live in. Surely it is not a world of indifference, still less of hatred. And for it to be free of those evils, it must not be one of globalized oblivion either. Ureneck, Smyrna, like the Salonika of my Sephardic grandmother Marguerite Saltiel, may her memory be for a blessing, is a city of ghosts. But not all of them are bloody specters. In his book we find also heroes, great souls whose light of individual conscience and courage may yet show us all a way, all of us Near Easterners, with a pocketful of currents. James R. Russell, Mashtot's Professor of Armenian Studies, Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts, November 2015. Prologue. American Evacuation. Wednesday, September 13, 1922. Smyrna was burning, and U.S. Navy Captain Arthur J. Hepburn prepared to evacuate the 125 Americans under his protection. A destroyer dispatched from Constantinople stood by in the harbor ready to take the Americans aboard. In his navy whites, which seemed to gather the dying light of the Mediterranean dusk, Hepburn was a smudged and sweating emblem of American prestige. He stood on the waterfront only a few blocks from the massive fire that was consuming the city and allowed his sailors a few moments to take their positions before he gave the command to begin the evacuation. The American citizens waited in a movie theater on the city's quay, a 2-mile promenade that traced the sweeping edge of the harbor. This was no ordinary city fire. Huge even by the standards of history's giant fires, it would reduce to ashes the richest and most sophisticated city in the Ottoman Empire. The fire would ultimately claim an even more infamous distinction. It was the last violent episode in a 10-year Holocaust that killed 3 million people, Armenians, Greeks, and Assyrians, all Christian minorities, on the Turkish subcontinent between 1912 and 1922. It would also serve as a marker of the end of the Ottoman Empire. Hepburn was a practical officer, and as the fire raced toward him and his men, he had no time to consider the fall of empires or the ways in which history pivots to crush old orders and create new nations. He had a job to do, and he had already made a mess of it by beginning the evacuation late. He had directed 2 Navy whaleboats and a motor sailor to stand ready at the quay's mossy seawall to ferry the Americans to the destroyer, but he faced another big obstacle. It was as dangerous as the giant wall of flame that was racing toward the waterfront. The fire had trapped a huge and surging mass of people on the quay. The crowd was packed tight for a half-mile or more in either direction. Nearly an entire city of people was caught on the narrow strip of cobbled pavement between the wall of flames and the sea. Hepburn had to somehow move the Americans through the dense crowd to the waiting boats. The transfer would be dangerous, maybe impossible. The people on the quay were desperate. They could see the flames and feel the intense heat just as Hepburn and his men could, and they too wanted to escape the fire, hoping that the American officer would take some of them on board. Surely the Americans would not leave them behind. America was the one country everyone in the Near East trusted: Arabs, Muslim Turks, Christians, and Jews, and at this moment Hepburn was standing in for America. Hepburn had decided to form a detachment of American sailors into a double line as a tunnel through the crowd. 20 young sailors, dressed in swabby whites and landing force leggings and armed with pistols and police batons, had taken their positions elbow to elbow and created a passageway from the movie theater door to the seawall through the frantic horde. Most of the people in the crowd were women with small children. Wild and fighting for their lives, they tried to break through the sailors' lines to board the Navy boats, which they saw as their only deliverance from certain immolation. The sailors had orders to beat them back, which they were forced to do by the sheer weight of the frenzied mass. It leaned and pressed against them as a single relentless body. Women were wailing, holding their babies over their heads. "Take my child with you! In the name of God, take him!" It was a frightful chaos of smoke, heat, screams, wild eyes, black kerchiefs, and military batons. The young American sailors held their ground against the refugees' desperation and constant shoving and pulling, and their 2 parallel lines, the sides of the tunnel, held. Hepburn gave the order to go, and the evacuating Americans passed quickly in single file out of the theater and safely between the sailors to the whaleboats bobbing at the splashing seawall. Some of the Americans were the wives and children of missionaries. Some were agents for American tobacco companies. Others were naturalized Americans of Greek and Armenian descent who owned farms and shops in and around Smyrna and faced possible execution if they remained ashore. Hepburn had orders to protect all of them. The destroyer, the USS Simpson, whose long gray hull, tall bridge, and deck guns came in and out of view through the thick smoke, was anchored less than 100 yards from the quay, and it had lowered its gangway to the waterline to take the Americans on board. As the Americans dashed between the sailors, a desperate man in the crowd jumped from the seawall into one of the half-full whaleboats, nearly capsizing it. The sailors immediately tossed him overboard. Other refugees leapt into the water and tried to swim to the Simpson and a second American destroyer, the USS Litchfield. None succeeded. Some were clutching children when they drowned, weighted down by their clothes and pulled below the surface by mushrooming heavy skirts. There were other warships in the harbor, British, French, and Italian, and the people tried to swim to them too. Those who had managed to reach the ships by stripping off their clothes before jumping into the water found that the ships' hulls loomed over them like tall and unscalable metal cliffs. In the choppy water, they gasped, shouted, and begged to be taken aboard, all the time trying to stay afloat. They banged on the ship's steel plate and grasped anchor chains. Bodies floated on the surface, some of them mangled by the propellers of the warships. There is no good time for a fire to break out in a city whose back streets are narrow and congested and whose neighborhoods are packed with wood and masonry houses. But this was a particularly bad moment for Smyrna to have been torched. During the previous 2 weeks, 300,000 refugees, nearly all homeless and destitute, had flooded into the city seeking its safety, a grim and deadly miscalculation. The refugees had crammed into the city streets, railroad stations, cemeteries, and school and churchyards. And then the Turkish Nationalist Army, from which they had been fleeing, had also entered the city and occupied it with thousands of poorly paid, hungry, and battle-hard troops. A nightmare of slaughter, rape, and robbery had ensued. As the fire spread across the city, residents were flushed from their homes, and the heat and flames pushed them and the mass of refugees to the quay. Some few minutes before 7 p.m., by which time the fire had claimed nearly half the city, and the blaze was more than a mile wide and a half-mile deep, Hepburn and his men had managed to transfer almost all the Americans to the destroyer. But 2 important evacuees were still missing, the American Consul General George Horton and his wife, Catherine. They were nowhere to be found, and the flames drove closer to the waterfront. It was getting dark, though the fire cast a dome of rosy light into the night sky, and the wind was lifting and gusting with the force of a gale. The fire had created its own howling storm, sucking in air and blasting geysers of cinders and flames into the sky. Hepburn could feel the searing heat on his arms and face, and his lungs burned with the acrid smoke blowing over the quay. Hepburn, a veteran officer with a reputation for thoroughness, already was angry with the consul general, and now there was this damnable delay that endangered the captain and his men. Hepburn looked again at his watch. It was now 7:30 p.m. The fire soon would reach the American consulate, then the movie theater. Leaving the consul general behind was out of the question. The captain had to assume that Horton was waiting until the last possible minute to board the ship, possibly supervising the loading of his personal collection of books, rugs, and antiquities, and that if he were to delay much longer, the sailors Hepburn had dispatched to get him would simply carry him and his wife to the quay. Hepburn estimated that the fire soon would breach the long line of waterfront mansions, hotels, and warehouses. He doubted that any of the crowd would survive if the fire came to the quay. It was too big and too hot, and the people had no barricade or shelter to protect them. The heat was so intense that the hemp hawser lines on some of the ships in the harbor had already ignited. Horses and donkeys were crazed and running up and down the quay and kicking madly to free themselves of the bundles on their backs that had burst into flame. The practical destruction of the entire wretched horde either by fire or drowning, Hepburn would later note in his official report, seemed inevitable. At 8:30 p.m., the consul general was still missing. Hepburn had no choice but to make his way back to the consulate. Finding Horton there, he ordered him to the quay for evacuation. Hepburn returned to the waterfront and again waited for Horton to arrive. Hepburn looked in every direction, his weak eyes straining. Then, coming up the street toward him, ahead of the fire, was the truck he had sent hours earlier to retrieve Horton and his luggage. It inched through the crowd, plowing through the people. Hepburn felt a wave of relief. As far as he knew, all the Americans he intended to evacuate were now accounted for, at least all those from the movie theater and the consulate. But there had been a lot of confusion, and he had begun the evacuation late and without an appreciation of the speed of the fire. Hepburn knew it was possible that he might be leaving ashore some of the American missionary workers who had refused the evacuation order earlier in the day, before the fire had reached its full fury. He had sent sailors in search of them, but the search parties themselves had gotten lost in the fire. There was also one American who had chosen to remain in the burning city, working furiously to cope with the nightmare around him. Asa Jennings, a former itinerant minister in the small towns of upstate New York, found himself in a tumult of panicked refugees at the far end of the city's quay, a few hundred yards from Turkish soldiers who were blocking retreat from the fire. Jennings had only just arrived in Smyrna a month earlier as an employee of the YMCA, and the violence and confusion around him were terrifying new experiences. He was a small and mild-mannered man in poor health, whose work in the previous few years had been to provide Bible study and hot coffee to decommissioning American and Allied soldiers in Europe. In the last week, confronted by intense suffering in the city, he had on his own initiative taken several quayside mansions that had been abandoned by wealthy Greek and Armenian owners when the Turkish army had been drawing close to the city, and turned them into makeshift safe houses for refugee women. Many of the women were pregnant. Others had been raped and badly injured by soldiers. Now he was intent on staying with them despite the fire. Several hours earlier, Jennings had put his family aboard one of Captain Hepburn's whaleboats for evacuation. Though his wife would have had trouble seeing him through the masses of people on the quay, Jennings had been able to watch the destroyer his family had been loaded onto depart through the smoke. Jennings's safe houses were about a half-mile north of the movie theater where Hepburn had loaded the Americans onto the destroyer. The young American sailors who had been watching over the houses were now gone. Jennings could see the Litchfield through the smoke from the front of one of the houses, and of course he could see the enormous fire. Its flames towered over the city and were reflected in the harbor. As he hobbled among the refugees, Jennings was absorbed with the work of caring for the people who had come to him for safety. In addition to the women, he had also collected hundreds of orphaned children, many of whom had watched their parents killed by Turkish soldiers. The children, as well as the women, looked to him for deliverance from the giant fire and the army. Before it burned itself out, the fire would destroy 13,100.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?